welcome to the Toledo Lucas County Public Library Sight and Sound Video History Project. I'm Tom Walton. I think it would be impossible for me to overstate how much I'm looking forward to our conversation today. I've been a baseball fan all my life, and more importantly for today's purposes, I'm an even bigger fan of our guest, Frank Gilhooley. I consider Frank Mr. Baseball in our region. From Swain Field to Skeldon Stadium to Fifth Third Field, he's seen it all. As a broadcaster and sportscaster for many years. And at a time in life when most people are retired, he still sits in once in a while with Jim Weber to broadcast Mudhens games. Frank, thanks so much for sitting down with us today. What a thrill this is for me to have you here.
It's nice to be here. Thank you for having me.
Your association with baseball is lifelong. Your father, Frank Gilhooley Sr., was a Major League Baseball player for a number of seasons. Let's start with your dad. Can you talk about his Major League career, Frank Gilhooley Sr.?
Well, we were pretty much born into it, we being my two sisters and myself. And when school was out in June, Tom, I can remember my mother, I was a little bit of a preschooler then. My sisters are older than I am. But she would bundle us all up and go wherever my dad was for the summer. I can remember living in Toronto, I can remember living in Buffalo, Rochester, and then he was player manager of Jersey City. So we got around a little bit, and then when September rolled around, 1st of September, why, the girls had to go back to school and we'd come home. And then he'd be home shortly thereafter.
What stories they had to tell of how I spent my summer vacation when I got back to school.
Yeah.
But your dad played in the majors for a number of years, right?
He played with the Cardinals, the Red Sox, and the Yankees, and a total of about 7 or 8 years in the major leagues. Mm-hmm. And,
now, he spent a number of years in the International League after his major league career ended. I guess he had a broken leg, and it never quite the same after that?
No, he broke his leg on the 4th of July down in Washington. He slid into second base, and the bag, they used to anchor it at the time with straps. It's a little different nowadays. And the strap wasn't tightened down. He let go, and his back spike caught on the
oh my gosh,
the rod in the ground and broke the leg. And in fact, that year, the 4th of July, they used to say if you were in first place on the 4th of July, you were going to win the pennant, or most teams did. But that year they had something like 5 or 6 of their regulars break legs or suffer season-ending injuries, including my dad's, and they finished in 3rd place.
There went the pennant, huh?
There it went, out the window.
His 15 years in the International League, I think he still holds some records in Buffalo, does he not?
Well, he did. Up until several years ago, he still had the career record for stolen bases. He was small and very fast, and he had the career record for stolen bases in Buffalo, and that I went over there and accepted for him when he was inducted into their Hall of Fame in that was, I can't remember exactly when that was, 1986 or something like that. But
well, even a little closer to home, your father was inducted into the International League Hall of Fame in ceremonies at Fifth Third Field not too long ago. That had Saturday to be a thrill for you.
Yeah, he had some great years in the International League and played with some great clubs. They won the pennant in 1925 in Toronto, the Toronto Maple Leafs they were called. And they had, among others, a second baseman named Charlie Gehringer, who was on his way up to stardom, and they had a left-handed pitcher named Carl Hubble, who went on to some greater things, too.
Yeah, absolutely.
Plus some older fellas who were on their way down. Steve O'Neill was the catcher after having an outstanding career with the Cleveland Indians, and then managed the Tigers, managed the Mudhens. So it was a combination of upcoming talent and some veterans that knew how to play the game.
Absolutely. Now, your father's path and your path crossed with that of Babe Ruth. And I think that's a fascinating story we need to share. Your father and Babe Ruth were actually roommates for a time with the Red Sox, is that right?
With the Red Sox, on the road. He roomed with them on the road. That's when somebody came up with the saying that he roomed with his suitcase rather than with the Babe himself, because he wasn't very often in the room.
So your father had the room to himself most of the time.
Yeah, but my dad always said he was hands down the best that ever lived.
No question in your father's mind, the best player who ever played.
Yep.
We have a wonderful photograph that we're going to share. I know you know all about this, a picture of you with Babe Ruth, that is you as a 2-year-old child in the babe's arms there. When was that taken?
1926.
1926.
During spring training, they, I forget who my dad was with then, and I can't tell from that uniform, might have been Reading, but he arranged at spring training, they played an exhibition game, and he arranged to have that picture taken. That's my only claim to fame, me and the babe.
You in the arms of the babe.
Yeah.
I understand that, in fact, Babe Ruth babysat for you or for your sisters.
My 2 sisters up in Boston, yeah. And my mother always said she had to keep a close eye on him because he'd feed them apple pie and stuff like that, you know, with his appetite, and they were just 2 little tiny...
I can't imagine the babe left much apple pie for the kids.
No, no.
And your dad said he was the best he ever saw. Were there other great players that he singled out over his years that you may have known as well? Joe DiMaggio, for example, came along later.
Yeah, Joe was the best I've ever seen.
The best you ever saw.
Best I ever saw, and my dad liked him too. But my dad always had a lot to say, a lot of nice things to say about Cobb, other than his character. You know, he was a wild man and cut your throat just to look at you.
His grandmother could be playing second base and he'd go up with the spikes high.
Made no difference to him. But, well, his record speaks for itself. And he always talked about Herb Pennock, the great left-hander with the Yankees, and Joe Bush, the right-hander with Boston, and Grove and people like that. But as far as the modern day people were concerned, he felt DiMaggio was as good as anybody he ever saw. And
you maintained a friendship with Joe for a number of years.
Joe and I became pretty good friends. He was a very nice man, a very private individual, but
and misunderstood as a result.
And always the gentleman. He was a perfect gentleman.
You talked about your summers on the road with your dad. Can you amplify on that a little bit? I mean, here you were a youngster traveling around major league ballparks and so forth, minor league ballparks. Living out a kid's dream, I would think.
Yeah. Of course, at that time, I was pretty young, Tom, and the ball game was secondary. You know, I was more interested in the peanuts and the pop and the stuff like that.
For some of us, that never changes, Frank.
That's true. But, yeah, I enjoyed the ballparks and running around in the ballpark, and my mother trying to track me down all the time. So it was a great experience.
Now, were you into collecting autographs like most of us were as a child?
No, I never got into that. That wasn't in vogue back then, I don't think. Not. I wish I had better sense, but at the time I didn't realize that ink evaporated. And Joe McCarthy and my dad were roommates in Buffalo for 5 or 6 years. And then McCarthy became manager of the Yankees, those great Yankee teams. And I always had a ball with Ruth and Gehrig and Selkirk and all of them, the whole bunch of them, and just kept them in a drawer. And then I went to pick them out one day and show somebody, and there was nothing there.
Well, the ink
blank.
May have evaporated, but the memories have not,
yeah,
and that's what is important here. Did you, as a child, given your exposure and constant involvement in baseball, have dreams like many of us did as youngsters of one day playing Major League Baseball yourself, following in your father's footsteps?
I wanted to be, but I just didn't have the talent. But I played in high school, and I played in college, and played in the service at Fort Meade, Maryland, the 2nd Army headquarters team. I played down there for a couple of years, but I didn't have the talent.
What was it like, Frank, growing up in Toledo in the 30s?
Well, I was born and raised here, Tom, and as far as I'm concerned, there isn't a greater city in the world. I love it. Always have, and I had a lot of fun. I had made a lot of good friends, and many of whom are still alive, and I get to see them frequently. Not many of them are still alive, you know. First thing I look at is the obituary column every day in the paper.
If you don't see your name, it's going to be a good day, right?
Yeah.
You attended Cathedral School?
Cathedral Chapel,
you have memories of Cathedral?
On Collingwood Avenue, yeah. That was fun. We played basketball there, and I remember one end of the gym was a solid wall, and you had to be some kind of an acrobat to go up for a layup up against the wall, or
without killing yourself,
or get killed. You know. And then I went to Central and had a great 4 years at Central, and boy, when I drive by there now, it looks like a small college campus
Really?
with all the improvements and everything. But it was a great school.
Well, before we get out of the 30s, I want to ask you about, you were a bat boy
Yes.
for much of that time.
Yeah.
You must have a lot of wonderful memories of your service as a bat boy.
I was bat boy at Swain Field starting in 1936, and when Fred Haney was the manager, and we had some pretty good ball players. They were tied up with the Tigers at that time. That was one. I think they had a working agreement with the Tigers 4 or 5 times since that. But we had names like Cullenbine, who was an outstanding young ball player, and Benny McCoy, and Fred Haney was the manager, as I said, and George Archie was an all-star first baseman. We had Ed Coleman, Babe Herman, who led the National League in hitting one year with Brooklyn, and
Now,
came to Toledo.
As a bat boy, weren't you actually out on the field during play?
Yeah.
Did you ever have a close call where you actually were involved in the...
No, and a couple of foul balls came over. One year they had the bats up along the box seats rather than at the dugout, and they were in a rack there. And I remember one night somebody hit a line drive over there that missed us, the two of us. There was another kid and myself about that much, or would have killed us both if it ever hit us. But we had bats all over the place, but nothing ever really close.
And of course that was long before helmets.
Oh yeah, no helmets.
Yeah.
Gee, I can remember Bud Parmalee hitting, can't think who was a St. Paul catcher, Johnny Pasek, I think. He hit him on the side of the head one Sunday afternoon, and the second baseman picked the ball up out back of second base. He really clanked him, no helmet, and he was a little leery for a while.
One of the characters I'm sure you remember well is Casey Stengel, who managed the Mudhens and the pennant-winning year and so forth. And then later, you must have...
Yeah, I ran across Casey several times down at spring training when he was with the Yankees, and he's one of the characters of all time. I can remember one day, my dad and I went to the ballpark over at Swain Field, and they used to play double headers every Sunday, and in the second game, Casey was coaching at third base. He wasn't in the lineup that day, and there was a rather loud-mouthed fan back of the dugout on the third base side, and he never let up on Stengel. He questioned every move he made, and about the ninth inning of the second game, Casey turned around and ran right over to the dugout and leaned on the dugout. He said, "You've been telling me what to do all day. Now tell me what to do." And there was a man on, and they were down by 1 run. "Now tell me what to do," loudmouth. And so anyway, the guy didn't know what to say. Stengel said, "I'll show you what I'll do." He put himself into pinch hit and hit one into Detroit Avenue and won the ball game. And he circled the bases as fast as he could possibly go, looking for this guy. He wanted him. He wanted a piece of him. And the guy took off, and Casey saw where he went. He jumped over the railing after he touched home plate, went after him, but never did get him. But he was going to settle the score that day.
I'd say the home run on the Detroit Avenue settled that score.
That should have. It sent the guy running, I'll tell you.
What about, there was a story, I think I've heard you tell it before, about Casey and some of his players that weren't performing up to his expectations and had to do with the railroad.
Well, Casey made a lot of money in the stock market. He was a very wealthy man. And after they won the pennant in 27, in 1926, the bottom fell out. They were down in last place, and so it was payday, and he's handing out the checks, and all the trunks, the equipment stuff was right in the middle of the clubhouse at Old Swain Field. And they're all sitting on the trunks, and he's handing out the checks. He said, "And by the way, I know I never say anything about the stock market. I don't like to give anybody any tips that don't pan out." But he said, now that you've got a few bucks for a few days, he said, if anybody is interested, I got one good tip for you. You might make some dough. And they all leaned in, he's not a bad guy after all. He said, "Buy all the New York Central stock you can get, because there's about 8 of you going out of here on it in the next day or two."
What a subtle way to tell them, huh?
Yeah. Buy New York Central stock.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned that you, after Cathedral School, eventually moved on to Central Catholic High School, and you played sports there too, right?
Yeah, I played basketball and baseball.
Basketball and baseball. What was that experience like for you, high school ball? You still had, somewhere in the back of your mind, this idea that I'd like to play in the majors someday.
Yeah, baseball was always my favorite, but we had a good basketball team. We went to the state finals before we got a lesson from Xenia Central.
Xenia Central.
Xenia Central.
Do you remember how you played in that game?
No, very hard, I know. We did get a bad break. We had a center named Bernard Hickey, and on the open, he was our big man. And incidentally, Tom, that was the last year that the Ohio High School Athletic Association played the tournament the same day. We played the semifinals at 3 o'clock and came back for the finals at 7, which was a little bit of an ordeal. They don't do that now. It's a week-long thing.
So you won the first game and then lost the second one.
We beat the #1 team in the state, Akron North, in the afternoon, and then came back at night in the finals. And on the opening jump, Bernard Hickey, who was our big man, came down and popped an ankle after the game was about 1 second old. So we were without our big man. But we lost to a better team, Xenia Central, and they were coached, by the way, by Tom Blackburn, who went on to big things at Dayton.
Yeah. And after Central, of course, you moved on to Notre Dame.
I went to Notre Dame and
played baseball for the Fighting Irish and basketball, I believe, right?
Yeah. Best 4 years of my life, I think.
Is that right?
Yeah. With the friendships I made and the people that I'm in contact with, and it was a great experience.
How was your baseball experience at Notre Dame?
Well, pretty good. We played for a man named Jake Klein, who was he was the baseball coach for close to 40 years. He had a full professorship in mathematics and was a wonderful man. He passed away several years ago, but Jake was a lot of fun to play for. He made it fun for us, and he was also very strict, but we had a good time.
Did you have a career goal in mind when you were at Notre Dame? Did you go to college with the idea that this is what I want to do if baseball doesn't work out?
No, not really. I really didn't have any idea what I wanted to do, and I just I could have studied a little harder than I did.
We can all say that.
Yeah,
yes.
I can remember they used to mail the report cards home, and they mailed mine home, and the man across the street yelled over to my dad, "What's Gil taking up there?" My dad was cutting the grass. He said, "Space as far as I can figure." So,
what a great line.
But it was good. We had a lot of fun.
So you were still sports oriented at that point. You hadn't thought about a major, or a career perhaps beyond that.
No, I never did. I just see what transpired, and I got out, and I finally wound up in radio, thanks to Doug Tabner. In fact, his brother Joe brought me down here today.
What transpired after college was the Army, was it not?
Yes, I was in the service.
Can you talk about your military experience?
Well, I was one of the fortunate ones. I didn't have any overseas duty, but I was at the 2nd Army headquarters in Fort Meade, Maryland, right outside of Baltimore. And that was about the extent of it. And then I had a chance to go into coaching, and I got a job in Detroit at Visitation High School.
I understand that wasn't something that you decided, wasn't for you.
No.
What were you coaching, baseball?
Football, coaching football and basketball. And then I went in the service before the baseball season started, but
what was it about coaching that turned you off, so to speak?
Well, I got off to a slow start on the football because I didn't know that much about it, never having played football myself, and I relied on a couple of my coaches at Central. They gave me a playbook, Jim McCarthy and Dutch Sherney. They gave me an old playbook, and I went from there and did the best I could, and I had no assistants. I was the staff, and we got hammered pretty good. It got to the point where I'd get home on Sunday after the games, and Sunday night I'd get in, and my father would say, "Did you win?" "No." "What was the score?" 24-0, and it was that way every week. Nothing, nothing, nothing. And then the last couple of weeks he said, "Did you get any first downs?"
And no longer asking if you won.
It got
Yes.
down to that. Yeah, so, but it was interesting.
Well, after that and after your military experience ended, can you tell folks how you got into radio, how you got into your first announcing job?
Well, that was a real strange thing. I came home. I went on the tour with the Globetrotters. We worked for Sid Goldberg, a late promoter here in town, a wonderful guy.
Mm-hmm.
And so we went on a tour with the Globetrotters, traveled all over the country and played them 7 nights a week.
I think we ought to clarify that were you a member of the Washington Generals?
No, there were 3. Abe Saperstein had a partner named Harry Hannon, and he said, "Why don't we get 3 white teams and have them have a little pennant race of their own, and then on the 4th day, or the odd day that they played the Trotters, they would be expected to go along with the routine and everything."
So 3 games out of 4 you could play hard. 1 game out of 4 you were the Patsies.
Yep, you went with the Trotters. And so it worked out very well, and we had a lot of fun. That was a great experience. But
I would imagine that if you're used to playing well, and you did, you were an excellent basketball player, to play badly didn't come easily.
Well, we didn't play badly because they were so good that we could go all out.
It still wouldn't matter.
But when they went into their different routines, you were expected to go along with it. And like Marcus Haynes, who was the magic dribbler they had, and we had Bobby Long, a Woodward High School standout, and a little guy who could move like a cat, and he chased him around, and that was one of the big parts of their whole show, the way he would dive after the ball and everything, and he and Marcus worked it out beautifully.
Uh-huh. It was all choreographed, though.
Yeah.
Trotters would win.
Yeah. Well, one year, the year before I went with him, John Payak, who's still around town, and George Bush, Jerry's brother, Jerry was coach at the university, and George played out there, and George Lindemann, and some great guys who were all gone with the exception of John Payak. He's still around. But up in Minneapolis one night, I don't know what happened to the Trotters, but they couldn't throw one in the ocean from the deck of a ship. Nothing. I don't know whether they were out all night or what, but they just didn't.
You're thinking, my God, we could win if we're not careful.
It didn't work, and they did beat them. Toledo beat them.
Oh.
The one time that they lost, and Payak couldn't wait to get on the phone and tell Sid, we beat them. Yeah. How bad was it? Have a good crowd? Sid, we beat him. He kept telling him.
He didn't want to hear that part.
And when he finally convinced him, he said, "Well, pack your bags. You'll be home in the morning, I'm sure." Saperstein isn't going to put up with that. But it worked out all right.
You knew Goose Tatum.
Yeah.
Goose Tatum, Marcus Haynes, all
team.
those guys. Eh?
Yeah, that was a good group.
There was a time when you're traveling and the bus broke down?
We broke down. Their bus broke down, and we were down south, I forget where, but in the deep south somewhere, and still the Jim Crow days, unfortunately. But Maury Saperstein, who was Abe's brother and stayed with the tour all the time and kind of managed things, he said, "I'm going to have to take your car." We had an 8-passenger station wagon with a carry-all on top for the baggage and everything. He said, and if you make it to Louisville, we're going to play in Louisville, and it was a packed house in Freedom Hall, so they didn't want to miss that. And he said, if you don't make it, don't worry about it. But he said, you ought to be able to get there in time. They'll have the bus ready. So here we go into Louisville. They got the bus ready, and here are 8 white guys riding the Globetrotter bus driving into downtown Louisville, hanging out the windows on a summer day, and people are looking. George Lindemann says, "The South will never get over this." But we got in there in time, and they played and got their bus back.
That raises an interesting question, Frank. What was it like being a white player traveling with the Harlem Globetrotters in an era in which, in many places in the South, they still couldn't go?
No, well, when we played on Sunday, We played a doubleheader on Sunday, day and night. In the South, this is. And it was left up to the whites. Do you want the day game or do you want the night game? And whichever one they selected, the blacks had the other one. But it was always standing room only, regardless.
Wow.
And
yeah. So did you see racial prejudice
a little
when you
bit,
traveled
but
with
not,
the team?
A little bit, but not too much. That was a great bunch. The only one who was really any kind of a problem was Goose, but we got along good with Tatum. We, the Toledo Mercuries, we hit it off pretty well with him. But he was a little bit on the mean side. But you had Irma Robinson, who was a graduate of San Diego State. You had Clarence Wilson, who was a college graduate, and Johnny Wilson, who later became principal of a high school in Chicago, went to Anderson College, and those people were entirely different. We had a lot of fun with them.
Well, they were good ambassadors, too.
Oh, great ambassadors.
People love to see the Trotters come to town.
Great ambassadors, and they put on a great show.
You did that for what, 2 years?
2 years, and then I did the PA work for them the third year.
Okay, and then ultimately got into broadcasting. Can you tell us how that happened?
The day I came home, my mother said, Red Smith wants you to call him. Well, Red Smith and I knew each other from Notre Dame. He was ahead of me at Notre Dame, but I got to know him when I was there, and he was a good friend of Moose Krause, who was the athletic director. And so I got to see him occasionally. And they had moved the Milwaukee franchise to Toledo because the Braves had moved out of, they folded up the Boston Braves and moved out to Milwaukee and became the Milwaukee Braves. So the American Association team had to go someplace, and the only thing that was available was Swain Field because, who was it, Danny Menendez? Is he the guy that moved them out in the middle of the night or something, moved down to Charleston? So this was the only ballpark available, and geographically it was ideal for the American Association. You know, you had Indianapolis, Columbus, Louisville, and many of the teams that are still in the International League now. So she said, my mom said, Red Smith wants you to call him. So I called him, and he said, come on over and go to lunch with me. So we went to lunch at the corner of Monroe and Detroit, across the street from the ballpark. And after a while, he said, you know, I need an announcer for this season coming up. And that was about 2 weeks away. And I said, gee, Red, I got home yesterday. I don't know who's working in town. He said, I'm not concerned about anybody working in town. He said, I'm talking about you. I said, hell, I never talked into a microphone in my life. He said, well, I don't have time to look around for anybody. He said, you've played the game, you know the game. He said, I think you'll do fine. And he said, I've made arrangements for you to get a little indoctrination. So that's how it happened. And he sent me down to Richmond, Indiana. Wade Hoyt, who the great Hall of Fame announcer for the Cincinnati Ball Club and a Hall of Fame pitcher for the Yankees. He was, back in those days, the teams used to break camp in the South, and they would come up north in pairs. And the Tigers and Cincinnati, year after year after year, would come up and they'd play a game in Nashville, they'd play a game in Knoxville, they'd play a game here or there, all while they were making their way up north for opening day. And so we got to Cincinnati and or went to Richmond first, and went over to Richmond, Indiana, and was the Tigers in Cincinnati. And then they moved over to Cincinnati and played a 2-game series there, and then they broke up and the Tigers went to Detroit, and Cincinnati was home and opening the season the next day or 2 days later, whatever it was.
So this was your trial?
That was my trial with Wade Hoyt. And I'll never forget, a very nice man, and he never said aye, yes, or no to me for the 3 days I sat next to him in the radio booth until the last day he drove me downtown to the hotel. And he said, I didn't say a whole lot to you, Frank. I was going to say you didn't say anything. And he said, I'm kind of a rookie at this too. I had no schooling, but he said, let me give you a couple of tips. He said, remember, you cannot repeat the score too often. He said, how many times have you gotten in your car and driven a block and said, well, what is the score?
Yeah.
And I remembered that, and he said, it's not your job to criticize organizations, players, umpires, or anything. That's not your job. And the third thing he says, remember, you can talk too much. I thought pretty good advice from...
You know what, there are announcers today who didn't get that lesson.
So that was it, and I started against the Columbus, they were called the Columbus Redbirds then, in 1953 out at Swain Field, and it was about, I think I've got it on the top of my score sheet somewhere, the temperature was 37 degrees at game time, and by the ninth inning it was considerably less.
Those April openings are tough.
And Gene Conley, the big tall right-hander, beat Columbus. He went the distance and beat them. They won the opener, and that's how it started.
And what was the home team called?
Sox.
The Sox.
Toledo Sox.
There's a story there, isn't there?
Oh yeah,
they weren't the Toledo Mudhens at that point.
No, they were the Sox, and they had a contest in town about naming the team, and somebody came up with Glass Sox, and the committee picked that one. Well, that lasted about 30 seconds with Red Smith. He says, ain't going to be the Glass Sox, I want to tell you. He says, take the glass off there, it's Sox, and give the guy who won the thing, give him all the prizes, which they did. He got them all, but it
was a hollow victory for the winner.
It wasn't the Glass Sox, that's for sure.
There's a program, in fact, from 1954 where they were indeed called the Sox. So, and how long did that last, that name?
The Sox were there 53, 54, and 55, and then they moved out to Wichita.
And then somebody got the bright idea, we got to go back to the Mudhens at some point.
Skeldon. That was Ned all the way.
Ned Skeldon.
Yep. He got the move going, got it all underway, and he said, and by the way, if we do get them back, if we're successful in this move, it's going to be the Mudhens again.
There was a gap there, again, without
Yeah.
minor league baseball, right?
10 years.
Yeah.
10 years.
They returned in what, 1965? 65.
Yep.
As the Mudhens.
As the Mudhens.
Okay.
Right. Out at Swain Field, or at the rec center.
Now, when you were doing radio in some of those early years, when you had, you were using a ticker for road games?
Yeah. Oh.
A telegraph, the wire. A lot of folks today, younger fans, don't have a clue what we're talking about.
I've enjoyed every single minute of broadcasting, whether they were winning, losing, whether it was football, basketball, baseball, made no difference, Tom. I enjoyed every single minute of it except that recreation. That was a job.
Explain how that worked. A lot of people don't realize what we're talking about.
I sat up in on the top floor of 515 Madison Avenue.
Not at a ballpark, but in an office.
In an office, in a little cubby hole, and there was a page printer there, and I had somebody if they were down in Louisville, I had a telegrapher down there sending me the ball game. And,
so you literally were pulling a tape out of the telegraph and reading.
It was on a page printer. It was a big sheet.
You had to make it sound exciting.
Yeah, that was a little tough to do.
Did you have any sound effects? You know, the crack of the bat, the roar of the crowd. How'd that work?
I had a tape going all the time, a crowd noise. After a while, people got onto it. It was the same thing over and over and over again. But oh, that was a chore, I'll tell you. One of the funny things that happened there, the Sox in '53, when they won the pennant, they were out in front down in Charleston. And it was about 2 weeks before the end of the season, and they were in pretty good shape then to win it, but still they needed a win. They needed to win all they could, and it started to rain down in Charleston, and it came down in buckets apparently, and Eddie T. Jones, a great writer for the Blade.
I remember Eddie.
Eddie was traveling with the team. He was down there.
And you're back home in Toledo broadcasting the game.
All alone up on the,
with the telegraph.
fifth floor, and every time the wind blew, that building creaked a little bit. And be perfectly honest with you, I was a little afraid up there all alone. And I finally got on the page printer and I asked the telegrapher, I said, let me talk to Eddie Jones from the Blade. And Eddie got on there and he said, what's the problem? I said, is it still raining? He said, you can't see your hand in front of your face. And it was then the 8th inning, and the Mudhens, or the Sox, were out in front by 6 or 7 runs. I said, Eddie, I'm getting scared up here. I said, would I be safe in saying that the game has been called off. I didn't want to say it's over and then have them start playing again 2 hours later.
You're on your way home.
Yeah, and he said, well, that's your call. You got to make that call, Frank. But he said, I'll tell you what, if it'll make it any easier for you, the ground crew just caught a 10-pound carp in back of second base. I said, that's good enough for me. The game has been called. And
so you announced to your audience it was over before it technically really was.
Yeah. And fortunately it was. They didn't resume play.
Now, how many years did you do radio then before moving on to television?
Oh, boy. After the 3 years, then I went to work with Doug Tabner doing sports shows and UT basketball, helping Doug there.
How was the transition for you from radio to TV? Now you're on camera, and a lot of it's going out live and so forth.
I never cared for television.
Really?
Never cared for it, other than doing play-by-play where you went on. But to sit there and do those, you know, with those red lights going on like that over there, you know. In fact, Venner always used to say, "Have you got your training pants on tonight?" You know.
Yeah.
It was a struggle. But I worked with some great people at Channel 13,
yes,
so it
indeed.
made it a lot easier.
You did that for a number of years too. Weren't you sports director there for a time?
I was, and I worked there for 16 or 17 years.
Were there funny moments on camera? I know all of us who've done that. I certainly have a share that I don't like to talk about, but things that go wrong.
Oh yeah, I think the best one for me was the Lucas County Fair was on out at the rec center, and it was the last day, and they wanted the crowning of the Miss Lucas County Fair Queen. It was about 1970, I guess it was. So they said, whatever you do, they send a camera crew out there, whatever you do, make sure you get the crowning and the girl's name and everything. Okay. So they went out there and spent the day out there, and they came back. This is in the days of tape, of film, as opposed to tape, Tom. And as you know, with tape, you can punch a couple of buttons and get something corrected in a matter of seconds.
Yeah.
But once you had the film, you were snookered. So Gordon was on my left.
Gordon Ward.
Gordon Ward. I was in the middle, and John Saunders was sitting on my right. Venner was on vacation. So Gordon reads the copy. It was about 1 minute and 11 seconds or whatever it was of the crowning, and he went over it time and time and time again, so he had it perfectly with he was coinciding with the film, and he's reading away. He says, the crowning of the highlight of the day was the crowning of Miss Lucas County Fair of 1970, the lovely Marjorie so-and-so. And he looked over at the monitor, and here's the rear end. In the meantime, the camera crew had gone through the animal barns, and they got the two reels mixed up. Got the two reels mixed up inadvertently, and he said, the lovely Marjorie so-and-so, and he looked over at it, and oh my, here is the rear end of the largest sow you ever saw in your life.
I'm sure the lovely Marjorie was not thrilled.
And Gordon came up with a great line that finished me off right there. He said, well, obviously that isn't Marjorie. So
man.
I started to laugh, and he started to laugh, and he pushed the copy over to me, and I pushed it to Saunders, who was the consummate newsman. And in the meantime, they got the right film up there and everything. He's looking at it.
The perils of doing live TV.
Yeah. He says, you guys are about as professional as that pig's rear end was up there a minute ago.
Yeah. Talking a little bit more about baseball, and one thing I want to talk about a bit, Frank, with you is and this is that old eternal argument, comparing eras. How would you compare the baseball of your father's time with the baseball played today in the major leagues?
Well, I think they're obviously bigger, stronger, and faster today.
And better paid.
Better paid. Oh my, yes, better paid.
Yeah.
But
how about the caliber of ball?
I remember I asked Joe DiMaggio that one time, And he said, they're bigger, stronger, faster, but he said, not better. And he said, that's not a rap at the ball players of today. He said, it's a rap at the expansion.
Sure.
He said, we served our time in the minor leagues and knew how to play the game when we got up there. He said, nowadays, he said, there are people coming out of high school, 19, 20 years old. He said that a lot of them don't know what the cutoff man is. They don't know how to bunt. That's obvious that they don't know how to bunt. They stab at the thing. He says they just never work at things like that.
Would the best players from your father's era be stars today? Babe Ruth, Lou Gehrig.
Oh, yeah.
Obviously, Joe DiMaggio would be a star today.
Yeah, he could play anytime. So could the Babe and Gehrig and all of them.
You look at Babe Ruth, you don't see a perfect physical specimen.
No.
And yet he would have been, in your opinion.
And you see lists now of people who are the home run leaders, modern day players, and you always see his name. He may be down there 7th or 6th or 7th place, but he's always in there with that 714.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And he's always regarded as the icon of the game. I mean,
And
the all-time great player.
Hall of Famer at two positions. He was a Hall of Fame pitcher.
He played the outfield on the days he wasn't pitching.
That's right.
Can you imagine that happening today?
That's how my dad got to play in Boston. When he pitched, my dad played right field.
Yeah.
Then,
now, you mentioned the expansion, and Joe DiMaggio cited that as a problem. You've got twice as many, almost twice as many, major league teams now as in that era when there were 8 teams in each league. So you got a lot of guys playing Major League Baseball today who'd be in the minors.
That's right. When you had 8 teams, some of them masquerading nowadays.
I would imagine there have been over the years some AAA teams that would have given some Major League teams a real run.
You take a look at those Kansas City teams and Minneapolis teams when I worked at the ballpark, when I was broadcasting in the 50s, when they had Rizzuto and Pretty and those Yankee ball clubs, and then Minneapolis came in with they had a working agreement with Boston. They had Ted Williams and those people. Why, my goodness.
Yeah, a guy like DiMaggio would go right to the majors now if he were coming up. He wouldn't have to do an apprenticeship in the minors as they did back then.
I asked Joe one time, I said, who's the best player you've ever seen, Joe? I said, you played for Cobb, you played under him, everything. Is he the best player you ever saw? Or Gehringer, I'm sorry. I asked Charlie that.
Charlie Gehringer.
And he said he was great, great competitor, but he said, no, he wasn't the best player. I said, who's the best player you ever saw? He said, Joe DiMaggio is the best I've ever seen. He said he could hurt you more ways than anybody I've ever seen. Hurt you with his glove, hurt you with his bat, hurt you with his legs, and he said he could do everything.
Do you concur with his judgment on DiMaggio?
Yeah. And Willie Mays would be my number 2 choice. There are people who can transcend and play now, could have played back then too.
Yeah. And the beauty of baseball, I think more than any other sport, is that these arguments are never going to be resolved.
Oh, no. Never.
It's part of the fun of being a baseball fan. You and I can sit here and argue eras and never satisfy each other with our feelings on it.
That's right.
Speaking of different eras, steroids weren't even part of the game when you were broadcasting, when your father was playing. It wasn't even a word that was known at the time. Substances that would help performance. How has this era of performance-enhancing drugs affected your perception of baseball?
Well, I've lost a great deal of interest.
Have you?
Much more than I had before. When I read about these people and all of the problems they have, not only the substance abuse, but the problems they have off the field, you never heard any of that before. Yeah, I can remember.
You don't wish to sugarcoat the 30s, 40s. I mean, Babe was a party guy. Ty Cobb was alleged to have been abusive, and the Babe as well. So they had off-the-field problems, but they weren't cheating on the field as far as we know.
No, there were a lot of guys around that weren't altar boys, but we had an infielder out at Swain Field on that picture you had there, the 36 or 37 team, Charlie Gilbert, who was a great infielder with the St. Louis Cardinals, and having played with the Gas House Gang in the middle 30s. And he had a great career cut short with a hunting accident. He blew part of his leg off during the off season, climbing through a fence in a shotgun. And I remember he used to wear a real tight elastic sock on the ankle. It was only half the size of his other ankle when he was with the Mudhens, and a wonderful guy. He later went on to coach was a college coach somewhere in Pennsylvania. He was from Pennsylvania too. And he talked about the Gas House Gang. He said how they were a team. He said wild men, you know. He said they had that, Frenchy Bordegaray had that Mudcat band that they used to play with all kinds of goofy instruments and everything. And he said one day Medwick came in and said, if we had more ball players and fewer musicians on this ball club, we'd be a lot better off. And he said the damnedest free-for-all you ever saw in your life in the clubhouse. And Frisch was the manager, the player manager, and he finally stopped it all. And when the game was over, they went out and won the game, and then they all went out afterwards and had dinner together. He said it was over.
And a few beers, no doubt.
Oh, yeah. And as soon as it was 9:30, because it was all-day baseball then.
Sure.
As soon as it was 9:30, Frisch would say, that's it, last call, let's get out of here. And they'd all go home.
Yeah.
Go back to the hotel.
So guys like Mark McGuire, Barry Bonds, Roger Clemens, what do you think of those guys now?
Well, great talents. Mm-hmm. I thought it was a waste of time on their parts to put that stuff in your system, but yeah, I don't know.
And to jeopardize your health down the road.
Oh, sure, yeah. Sure.
How has putting all that aside, how has the game changed? You talked about they were all day games back in those days. Mm-hmm. Night baseball came along later. They traveled by train when there were only 8 teams in each league. That's all gone. It's all changed now, isn't it? It's a different game today.
An entirely different game. And I think probably the biggest single thing, aside from the expansion, is the artificial turf. I can imagine some people. Can you imagine Williams hitting on artificial turf?
Oh, my God. He might have hit 500.
He'd have hit 400 4 or 5 times. I'll guarantee you he would have.
Yeah.
I think.
What back control he had.
Oh, boy.
Yeah. Yeah. What you talked about the fan who was heckling Casey Stengel. How about fan behavior? Now they're fueled by alcohol, and by the 7th inning, a great many of them were already intoxicated. But is there as much good-natured heckling as there used to be, or is it actually more abusive?
Well, up where I working, you don't hear too much of it. You don't hear what they're saying, but I suppose there are a few leather lungs that get on them pretty good, but. Normally, you don't hear of anybody going into the stands very often, like they used to. Well,
now certainly another change in the game is racial, because it was a white man's game in the major leagues until Robinson and Doby came along in the late 1940s, and then black players proved just how grievous an oversight that had been, because guys like Willie Mays came along, and of course. Robinson and Doby, they were great black players. Oh. Now you're seeing the influx of Hispanic players. Blacks not so much. Why do you think that's happening?
I think the blacks have gone to basketball. Mm-hmm. I really do. You know, you drive around town and look at any playground where there's a hoop up, they're playing basketball. Mm-hmm. But there are some great ones. They've got a lot of ability. They were blessed with physical ability. Yeah. They can run, they're strong. Oh, yeah. Leap.
Well, look at the rosters today, though, and you see Gonzalez, Ramirez, Hernandez, all up and down, almost every team in the majors, because for many of these young men, it's a ticket out of a poverty situation, out of a third world situation.
And they have the warm weather down there the year around. They play down there all the time.
Now, another change you mentioned, and I regret, is the end of Sunday doubleheaders. I can remember as a child getting on the train in Bellevue, riding, I didn't live in Toledo at the time, and riding the train to Cleveland and going down on a Sunday for a Yankee doubleheader that would fill the old municipal stadium with 80,000 people for 2 games. Sure. Today it's all about separate admissions, making money for the concessionaires and all that stuff. But how do you feel about that? I used to really enjoy. If you lost the first game, hey, we got another shot.
That's right. My dad and I used to walk over every Sunday from our house over to Swain Field and watch the doubleheader and walk home.
Yeah, and now it's almost like asking the guys to play an exhibition at Cooperstown on their day off is a tremendous affront. Yeah. Yeah. Can you talk about that a little bit, about the pampered, well-paid athletes of today?
Well, I think, Tom, if the owners are willing to pay it, they'd be foolish not to go after it.
We'd do the same thing probably.
That's right,
if we could,
sure.
if we were offered that kind of
Sure.
money.
And they all have agents nowadays, you know, that changed things around a little bit. They want that 10%. It used to be 10% right off the top.
Yeah.
I think it's a little more now.
Yeah. You just
How would
wonder.
you like to be a caddy for Tiger Woods nowadays?
Yeah. And a lot of times, of course, a player might be ready to sign, and the agent says, "No, I think we better hold out for more."
Yeah.
You know, something else that has changed. And that's the end of player managers. You mentioned a couple earlier. Of course, Lou Boudreau was a case that comes to mind. I think Frank Robinson might have been the last one in the major leagues with Cleveland. But there was a time when managers played.
Sure.
Was that the case in Toledo?
Fred Haney played. He was the manager when I was clubhouse boy, bat boy and clubhouse boy. He played third baseman. He'd been a third baseman in the major leagues and played pretty well. Not every day. He wasn't in there every day, but he did play. And they had an outfielder named Bib Falk, who was a major leaguer who managed the Mudhens, and he played. I can't think of.
Joe Gordon was another one, I think, at the
Joe
major
Gordon.
league.
Yeah.
And
Yep.
nowadays,
Boudreau was a great player.
And how he managed that team to a pennant in
how old
1948,
was he?
a World Series victory, and played every.
Well, how old was he? 24, 25,
Isn't
something
that
like
amazing?
that?
Yeah. But if there's a job tougher than being a major league manager, it must be a minor league manager.
AAA managing
AAA.
is the toughest job in all of baseball, I think, because you're working for the major league team, and they tell you what you're going to do, who you're going to play, and where they want them played, and everything else.
Yeah,
And
somebody comes in on a rehab assignment, your
all
job
you
is
do
to.
is say yes, sir.
Yeah, absolutely.
But we've been blessed here with Larry Parrish. He gets along fine with Detroit, and
He understands his role.
yeah, he understands his role, and he went through it all as a major leaguer, and and he has good assistants in Bull Durham, Leon Durham, and A.J. Sager.
And put together a run of a few championships and so
bet.
forth, even though there were the occasional call-ups.
Well, the call-ups hurt, but people don't understand that's what we're here for. The Mudhens are here to get somebody ready for the major league team.
What changes would you make in the game, Frank, if you were commissioner for a day? Would you
Get
speed
rid
it up?
of the artificial turf. And
Get rid of artificial turf?
Yep.
Go back to grass?
Right, quick. Go back to grass and speed it up wherever I could. And but other than that, it's still the national pastime as far as I'm concerned. Great game.
One thing that bothers me is the slow pace of the game, and the hitters step out of the batter's box after every pitch and readjust their gloves.
The gloves. And I saw somebody a couple of weeks ago. He got on first base, took the gloves off and handed them to the first base coach, reached in his back pocket and got sliding gloves
Had
on.
a different pair of gloves.
Yeah, different
Boy,
pair
talk
of
about how the game has changed. You announced for the Hens at Old Swain Field, at Monroe in Detroit, and later at Skeldon Stadium in Maumee, as we mentioned, and finally at Fifth Third. Let's talk about those three ballparks, but first I want to talk about Swain Field. Fans actually took trolleys, as I understand,
Long
2
belt
games at Swain
streetcar,
Field. The line ran right past the ballpark.
Yep.
And they got dressed up. They in their finest hats,
hats.
And coats and ties for the gentlemen and dresses for the ladies. Hard to imagine that now.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it's and it started to change when we got out to the rec center. It was a little more freewheeling out there then, and then downtown. I tell Joe Napoli all the time that I still get as big a thrill every time I walk in there as I did the very first time.
So do I, Frank.
Great ballpark.
Yeah. Ultimately, of course, Swain was demolished to make way for a shopping center. Do you remember when it was torn down, what your feelings were?
2 days after the season ended, we were called to we were invited to a luncheon at the Hillcrest Hotel, and the following day, the season ended on a Sunday, and we were invited to lunch at the Hillcrest, and the nicest man in baseball at that time was a man named John Quinn. He was a vice president of the Milwaukee Braves, and that organization then was run by the 3 little steam shovels. Remember the heck was their name? An Italian name. They were in the building business, and John Quinn had succeeded his dad as the vice president of the old Boston Braves.
Yeah.
Old Mr. Quinn was one of the patriarchs of the game, and they sent the nicest guy in the world in to throw the hatchet at us. Poor John, of all people, and he was almost in tears. After we had lunch, he handed out the release that they were leaving, going to Wichita. Now, the vice president in charge of everything was a man named Joe Carnes, and he's gone now, so I can say it.
So there wasn't a whole lot of warning this was coming?
Nothing, nothing. Everybody thought it was just a...
And 2 days after the season ended, the wrecking ball shows up?
A couple days later, it was in there. I was sick. I really was sick. I can't tell you how badly I felt about that.
Yeah.
I couldn't believe it. I really couldn't.
I think there's still a section of that old outfield fence still standing out
in
there.
left field. There's a section of about
beyond the back of the shopping center.
40 feet. Yeah, it's got holes in it and everything else.
I was hoping they could move some of that to Fifth
Downtown,
Third, but it's so fragile.
Yeah, they tried. They thought about it, but couldn't work it.
Well, let's talk about Skeldon. You mentioned Ned Skeldon earlier, the stadium that bears his name out at the rec center. Opposing players weren't real crazy about Skeldon, were they?
No, they weren't, because of where the clubhouses were concerned, where they were located, and they had to walk through the crowds and everything. But after Ned got in there, they fixed that field up pretty good. You know, that was a racetrack.
It was an old grandstands for the race at the fairgrounds.
Yeah, fairgrounds. And about 3 or 4 feet down was a layer of clay, hard clay. And as a result, if you had a big downpour, a rainstorm, it went so far and then stopped. It didn't go through the clay. That didn't absorb it at all, and it just laid there. So Skeldon came in, and Ned said, we want that out of there. So he got all of the grass, the sod and everything, and did it all over and put new seats in and everything else. And at the end, it passed for a pretty decent ballpark.
And then finally, of course, in, 2002, I believe, the Hens made the biggest move of all to what was quickly deemed the grandest minor league ballpark in America by Newsweek magazine, among others, to Fifth Third Field. Did you ever imagine that AAA baseball would be back in downtown Toledo?
No, I didn't. But I know that Gene Cook and Ned and Monsignor Schmidt, those people all had it in the back of their minds. They were going to have it downtown if they possibly could, and they finally did. And Henry Morris, too. Henry Morris was involved in that group.
And you wouldn't realize, you might not understand how the surroundings can affect a team's performance, but the Mudhens have been competitive and won championships since moving to Fifth Third Field.
Yep. And look at the crowds they're drawing. Of course, that's a tribute to Joe Napoli. Joe has surrounded himself with great people.
Yes, he has.
It's some organization.
And you mentioned Gene Cook, and we can't overlook the job Gene did as general manager of the Hens all those years. Gene and Joe, between them, the Hens have had 2 outstanding baseball men.
Gene Cook hired Joe Napoli. Yep. Yeah, they were both very, very, very cooperative and very capable.
Yes, indeed. You've broadcast thousands of baseball games over the years. You've described what it was like doing road games with a ticker, and of course many, many home games. There must have been a few that stand out in your mind. Can you share any memorable moments from your broadcast career in the booth of games that were just so remarkable?
Well, I've worked for many years with Jim Weber, and we've seen some great finishes out here, or down at
Fifth Third
Field.
Sure.
Yeah, great 9th inning finishes and later and extra inning games, home runs, and it would be hard to really pinpoint one. I remember the night that the no-hitter that Jose Lima pitched out there, and
it's a tremendous family experience out there at Fifth Third, isn't it? Like we're saying,
I think that's the key.
It doesn't really matter if the team wins or loses at the AAA level.
That's the key. It's a fun place to go.
Yeah.
For family. It's family oriented.
Yeah.
Yep.
What a remarkable career you've had, Frank. I'm wondering, was there anything short of starring for the Yankees in center field that you would do differently?
No, not a thing. Not a thing. I'd like to do it all over again. And it's been a great run, and I wouldn't change a thing, Tom.
Well, on that note, I congratulate you for a wonderful career. You're 84 years old, still occasionally showing up in the broadcast booth with Jim Weber.
I've been ill all summer, and I went down one day. It's funny. They had a noon game about 3 or 4 weeks ago, and I said, if I don't make another one, I'm going to get down there for that. So I went down and I filled in with Jason Griffin and Jim, and they went 12 innings. 4 hours and 18 minutes. It took me a week to recover.
Boy, of all the games to choose.
Oh, boy, I picked a great one.
Well,
but no, it's been a great run.
I hope we get you back in the booth a number more times and they don't run 4 hours or 12 innings, okay? On that note, I would wonder if you would honor me by, I brought along a baseball and a pen as we close.
I'll try.
If you would be so kind to do me that honor.
My penmanship.
Frank, thanks so much for your time, and it's been a delight, and I'm glad we had this chance to talk about baseball today. Thanks so much.
I enjoyed every bit of it, Tom. Thank you for having me. It was fun.
There it is, folks. Frank Gilhooley Jr. signed it for me. This goes into a place of honor in my collection of baseballs, signed autographed baseballs at home. Frank Gilhooley, thanks so much again for being with us. It's been a delight, and just learned so much about you today, and it's a thrill to consider you a friend. Thanks again. And we hope you'll be back with us next time on the Sight and Sound Video Project. Thanks.